If you want to take your dog off leash, I'm here to tell you that there are a lot of different ways to get there. There are varying degrees of what I would consider off leash freedom for my dog. I'm gonna go over these from most difficult to least difficult. And the one thing I want you to think about when you're considering difficulty level is time. No matter what kinds of techniques you use, the more difficult I rate it, the longer it's probably gonna take to train. So keep that in mind when you're trying to decide what's right for you and your dog. I'm curious as to where your dogs are at, but I want to start with true off-leash. Now, true off-leash doesn't mean that we're running around in a field somewhere where they're allowed to be off-leash. To me, off-leash skills require the dog to be under your control still, even if they're not on the leash. So if I took my dog to a fenced-in area and just let them run around and I'm not watching them and I'm not trying to give them verbal cues or otherwise, I don't consider that off-leash. Or at least that's not the off-leash that I'm talking about here. So for me, the ultimate truly off-leash skills is their ability to be off-leash with little to no input. That means they're staying relatively close to me. I make lots of videos on something called orbiting. It means that they're watching me for changes in direction. It means that they're not going to take off after things that are inappropriate to take off after, like a squirrel. Then there's regular off-leash skills, which I would consider being under verbal control, where I could give instructions like maybe a long-range downstay, or an instruction to close the radius where they're wandering a little bit too far and maybe they need to come a little closer. The next kind of level of difficulty is where there's tactile feedback. So something physically is going to affect the dog to get their attention back in case of an emergency. Whether that's an e-collar, or in Link's case, we use something called a drag line, where we just have a long line that drags behind him. Then we have full physical control at a distance, which would be if instead of having a long line that's dragging behind him, I'm holding onto the handle and possibly using leash pressure to help direct him. And to me, this is kind of the easiest place for you to get to. If we're walking down the street and I have him on this long line and I am holding this handle, he could walk easily to both sides of the street. He can do a lot of sniffing, and that's not a problem. And so at that point, we're simulating the off-leash experience without him actually being off-leash. Now here's the real question though, is which one is right for you? And that's gonna depend on a lot of factors. The biggest one I mentioned earlier, and that's time. I've had 9 years of working with that one, and we can walk off leash and she stays within a 30-foot radius of me. She'll notice any change of directions. It's perfect. I don't want to say it took 9 years, but it took a long time to get there. The second factor you're going to want to consider is what kind of environment are you taking them off leash in? Here, we don't really have very many places where he's allowed to be off leash. And so the drag line works for us. Usually when we're in the front yard, he's just out on the long line and it is there in case of emergencies. I'd really love to hear about where you're at with your dog and why you either chose to be there or where you plan to be.